series of an all-out assault on freedom.
Just a few months before I was kicked out, I was already attracted a lot of attention by the government with my reporting back then. There was an arrest warrant against me. We thought that they wouldn't come to the newspaper, so I actually stayed in the newspaper overnight, but they came to the newspaper. And my editors were staying with me, so they told me that I should flee from back door.
I left Turkey because of the prosecutions that had been brought against me. I had already been to jail for my journalism, so this time I chose a different path.
Bu yolu tercih etmedim.
I was facing 20 to 25 years in jail. My passport had been revoked. So like many refugees, I got on a boat and crossed the Meriç River to Greece.
Botun üzerine Yunanistan'a geçtim.
I published a story about the government of Turkey who was trafficking arms to a neighboring country illegally. I found myself in jail first and then in exile. Of course, leaving the country was not an easy decision. I left my hometown, my family, my job, my paper, my library, my dog, everything, my life. I left it behind. But I knew that this is the price of being a journalist.
Can Dündar, Çağdaş Kaplan, Mahir Zeynalov. Just 3 among scores of Turkish journalists now living in exile. For the past few years, the government of President Erdogan has carried out an aggressive campaign, monitoring, targeting, prosecuting and jailing reporters. For some, the situation became so dire their only option was to flee.
Can Dündar was one of the most prominent newspaper editors in Turkey. He ran Cumhuriyet, the country's oldest daily, a centre-left paper that routinely investigated and took on the ruling government. For the past 3 years, he's been living here in Berlin. He came here after spending time in a Turkish prison for publishing a story that exposed illegal arms support, weapons that the Turkish intelligence services were providing fighters in Syria. He was sentenced to almost 6 years behind bars, and he decided that life in Turkey was no longer an option.
Bu haberi özel haber olarak yapan kişi de öyle zannediyorum ki bunun bedelini ağır ödeyecek.
He couldn't deny the story because it was true, but he said it was a state secret, so it shouldn't be revealed. So I was getting a lot of threats by the government and by the troll army. I was attacked in front of the courthouse. I saw someone coming to me and he called me a traitor.
So you were convicted for revealing state secrets, but you pleaded innocent and were appealing the decision. Why didn't you stay in the country to clear your name?
Because I lost trust in Turkish judiciary. After the military coup attempt, Erdogan changed the whole system. The first thing he has done was to arrest the high judges who decided for our release. So they are still in jail without independent justice. Really, you can't defend yourself. So that would have been putting my head into the guillotine.
Bu metnin tüm Türkiye Cumhuriyeti kanallarında yayımlanması Türk Silahlı Kuvvetleri'nin bir emridir.
On July 15th, 2016, a faction of the Turkish army attempted a coup. It was a spectacular failure. Using some of the very media outlets he'd been attacking before, Erdogan rallied popular support, stopping the coup in its tracks.
Milletimizi illerimizin meydanlarına davet ediyorum, havalimanlarına davet ediyorum.
The government pinned the blame on the Gulenist movement, forces loyal to the Islamist cleric Fethullah Gulen, a one-time Erdogan ally turned enemy. The event was a watershed moment in the country's history, and for the media, it marked a seismic shift in their fortunes. Within 2 weeks, more than 100 media outlets had been shut down, and in the years since, those considered inconvenient to the government have been taken over by Erdogan allies. while journalists critical of his policies have been systematically rounded up and imprisoned. One of the media houses forced to close was Zaman, a company widely seen as close to the Gulenist movement. Mahir Zeynalov worked for Zaman's English-language newspaper, Today's Zaman. But his struggle with the government had started well before the coup.
On 25th of December 2013, I wrote an article about the corruption case which targeted President Erdogan. So when I wrote that story, all hell broke loose for me. One of the newspaper just published my profile picture, just saying that Turkey, beware of this traitor. And on that day, President Erdogan pressed charges against me, seeking up to 6 years in prison.
Why do you think the Erdogan government and Erdogan specifically took such extreme measures?
There are some red lines that you should not cross. One of them is undoubtedly corruption investigations that targeted President Erdogan. Another thing is the military coup attempt. You cannot question it. There's also the Kurdish issue. There are like over 60 journalists that were deported from the country. And most of them were kicked out of, expelled from the country just because they wrote about Kurdish issue, Kurdish conflict.
The battle in the southeast of the country between Turkey and Kurdish insurgents demanding equal rights and autonomy has lasted more than 40 years. The leading insurgent group, classified as a terrorist outfit by Ankara, is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. The group, its leaders and its message are all red line issues. Covering human rights abuses by Turkish forces is fraught with challenges, and Kurdish language media operate under significant restrictions. Çağdaş Kaplan was one of 32 Kurdish journalists arrested back in 2011. For him, the most dispiriting thing was not so much his arrest, but the lack of support and solidarity from his fellow journalists.
O zaman Kürt medyasına
The journalists who didn't speak up for the Kurdish media back then, today they are the ones being victimized. I hope my colleagues don't mind my criticisms because I'll criticize them on any platform. For example, Zaman newspaper. When Zaman was shut down, I defended them and said it was illegal. But when I was arrested in 2011, Zaman labeled me a press terrorist.
Pres terör diye manşet attı.
He's absolutely right. And I think many newspapers yesterday and today failed to support those causes. And that's a tragedy of the Turkish society, is that the victim does not support the other victims. And Kurds have always been alone in this fight.
They're not alone anymore. All three of these exiled journalists have been classed as, quote, terrorists by the Turkish state. We contacted various representatives of the government requesting interviews. However, none of the officials agreed to speak with us. From their homes in Athens, Washington, D.C. and Berlin, Kaplan, Zeynalov and Dündar continue with their journalism. It hasn't been an easy journey, particularly so for Dündar.
What sort of pressure or intimidation have you continued to feel, both from the Turkish government but also from the pro-Erdogan supporters living here in Germany?
There are a lot of Erdogan fanatics around, and they are trying to intimidate. And there's a Turkish intelligence activists here. I guess there are informants among the society.
And Erdogan himself came to Germany and called you out, is that right?
Ajandır, devletin sırlarını ifşa etmiştir.
Officially, he asked German government to give me back to Turkey. But thanks God, German government knows what's going on in Turkey.
For some of Turkey's exiled journalists, those goings-on resemble a living hell, one in which the ability to report freely, to hold power to account, and to expect due process seems all but dead and buried.
Bu ülkede basın ve ifade özgürlüğü.
Freedom of the press in this country has been buried in a big grave by our leaders, not just by Erdogan. We have to fight for it, just like our other rights. We have the power to dig up these fundamental rights from the grave, but we can only do that by resisting. Otherwise, it's impossible.
Direnmezsek mümkün değil.